The evening had been calm, almost too calm, until everything changed in an instant. My mother, Patricia Anderson, was only a few weeks into her recovery from knee surgery, still adjusting to life with limited mobility. She had been resting in the recliner, flipping through an old crime novel, when her breathing became shallow and erratic. I had just stepped into the kitchen to grab her some tea when I heard the first wheeze. At first, I thought it was just a momentary discomfort, a side effect of the pain medication, but then she clutched her throat, her eyes wide with panic. The tea slipped from my hands, shattering on the tiled floor, as I sprinted to her side. Her lips were swelling rapidly, her skin turning a sickly shade of red. It hit me like a brick. This wasn't just a minor reaction. This was anaphylaxis. My mother, the formidable chief of police who had faced down criminals and led officers through some of the toughest situations imaginable, was now gasping for air right before my eyes. Without a second thought, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking as I pressed the numbers. The dispatcher's voice was calm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. "Stay with me," I murmured to my mother, gripping her hand tightly as the dispatcher assured me help was on the way. Time crawled at a torturous pace as I knelt beside my mother, whispering reassurances while inwardly cursing how helpless I felt. The wailing sirens in the distance were a lifeline, but just as relief started creeping in, it was snatched away by something, or rather, someone I hadn't anticipated. Deborah Williams, the overzealous, power-hungry president of our homeowners association, had made it her personal mission to enforce the most ridiculous community rules with an iron fist. From banning holiday decorations to dictating the height of residents' grass, she thrived on control. Unfortunately, tonight would be no different. As the ambulance approached our gated community, it came to an unexpected stop at the entrance. I craned my neck toward the window and felt my blood boil. Deborah, dressed in her usual pearl necklace and immaculately pressed blazer, stood in front of the vehicle, her arms crossed like a gatekeeper from hell. I couldn't hear her from this distance, but I could tell from the frantic gestures of the paramedics that she was arguing, blocking their path. The sirens, which had been a beacon of hope, suddenly felt like an eerie wail of helplessness. My mother let out a strangled breath beside me, her body trembling. I didn't have time for this. I bolted from the house, sprinting toward the entrance of our pristine, too-perfect neighborhood. As I neared the commotion, Deborah's nasally, self-important voice came into focus. "I'm sorry, but the HOA has strict policies against sirens after 9 p.m. We have noise regulations in place for a reason. Also, this vehicle is parked too close to the hedge, and that's a violation of—" Her words cut off as I skidded to a stop, panting, my hands clenched into fists. "Are you out of your damn mind, Deborah?" I roared, pointing at the ambulance. "My mother is having a medical emergency, and you're blocking the paramedics?" She sniffed, unfazed by my anger. "I'm simply enforcing community standards," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "If we let one emergency vehicle through without proper regulation, what's to stop others from doing the same? There's an order to things, young man, and rules exist for a reason." One of the paramedics, a burly man with a frustrated expression, stepped forward. "Sir, we need to get through. If we don't reach the patient in time—" Deborah cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Well, maybe if they had turned off the sirens, we could have avoided this whole situation." My heart pounded in my chest, fury and desperation warring inside me. I needed a way to break through her ridiculous power trip before it was too late. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my rage in check, and fixed Deborah with a glare so sharp it could cut glass. "You know who my mother is, right?" I asked, my voice low but steady. She rolled her eyes. "Of course I know. Patricia Anderson, resident of Lot 14. Her tone was dismissive, as if my mother was just another name on her endless list of rule-breakers. I stepped closer, narrowing my eyes. "She's also the chief of police." The effect was immediate. The color drained from Deborah's face, her posture stiffening like a board. For the first time, she hesitated, glancing nervously at the paramedics. She's on medical leave," she stammered, as if that somehow changed the fact that she had just obstructed emergency services for the city's top cop. "Doesn't matter," I snapped. "Right now, she's struggling to breathe, and every second you waste standing here playing Queen of the Gates puts her life at greater risk. You really want to explain to the mayor why the police chief died because you were worried about hedge trimming violations?" The paramedic seized the moment, stepping around her with a firm, "Move, ma'am, or we'll call the real authorities to handle this." Deborah, visibly shaken, stepped aside, and I didn't waste another second. I sprinted back toward the house, the ambulance finally rolling forward behind me. As I rushed inside, I barely noticed the sweat trickling down my forehead or the tremor in my hands. My mother's eyes were half-lidded now, her breathing wheezy and labored. The paramedics quickly set to work, assessing her vitals, administering oxygen, and preparing an epinephrine injection. But I couldn't stop thinking about the sheer insanity of what had just happened. If I hadn't pushed back, if I hadn't used my mother's title to force Deborah's hand, how much longer would she have delayed help? As the paramedics stabilized my mother and prepared to transport her, I caught sight of Mark, the neighborhood security guard, standing at the doorway. He had been the one to radio the ambulance past the gate when Deborah tried to stall them even longer. "I heard what happened," he said grimly. "She tried to tell me to turn them away, but I called it in to dispatch instead. Figured she was on one of her power trips again." I exhaled, shaking my head. "She nearly cost my mother her life." Mark nodded, his expression dark. "And I'm guessing she won't take responsibility for it either." He was right. Deborah Williams never admitted fault. But I had a feeling this time she wouldn't be able to sweep it under the rug. Not when she had just made an enemy out of the chief of police. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I sat beside my mother's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. The epinephrine had done its job, reversing the worst of the reaction, but she was still weak, her voice hoarse from the ordeal. The doctors assured us she would make a full recovery, but I couldn't shake the anger burning inside me. Just as I was lost in thought, my phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number flashed across the screen. "We need to talk. HOA business. Deborah Williams." I stared at it, bile rising in my throat. She had the audacity to reach out now? I ignored the message, but it didn't matter. Deborah showed up at the hospital later that evening, a forced, saccharine smile plastered on her face. She stood awkwardly at the door, a bouquet of cheap grocery store flowers in her hands. "I just wanted to check in," she said sweetly, as if she hadn't just risked my mother's life hours earlier. My mother, still groggy but as sharp as ever, turned her gaze to Deborah. "Check in," she repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "You mean after blocking my ambulance?" Deborah tittered nervously. "It was all a misunderstanding. I was just enforcing community rules. You understand, don't you, Chief Anderson?" My mother's expression hardened, and I could see the fire returning to her eyes. "I understand you nearly got me killed over some hedge regulations," she said coolly. "And now you're here, hoping to smooth things over so I don't take action." Deborah's smile faltered. She knew my mother wasn't the type to let things. I thought Deborah would leave it at that, try to slink away and pretend none of this had happened. But, in true Deborah Williams fashion, she found a way to make things worse. The next morning, as I stepped outside to grab the mail, an envelope from the HOA was tucked in between the usual stack of bills. I already had a bad feeling, and sure enough, when I tore it open, my blood boiled. A $150 fine. Violation. Improper use of emergency services. I stormed back inside, waving the letter at my mother, who was now recovering at home. She read it once, then again, as if she couldn't believe her own eyes. "She fined us," I seethed, "for calling 911. My mother let out a low, humorless chuckle. "She really thinks she can get away with this?" I could see the gears turning in her head, the look she got when she was about to go to war. She grabbed her phone and started making calls, to the city attorney, to her deputy chief, and finally, to the property management company that oversaw the HOA. "We're handling this today," she said, her tone steely. "She thinks she's above the law. Time to remind her she isn't." That evening, an emergency HOA meeting was called, and I knew exactly why. Deborah had caught wind of my mother's calls and was scrambling to contain the fallout. When we arrived, the community center was packed, residents whispering among themselves, many of whom had heard the rumors. Deborah sat at the head of the table, her usual smugness intact. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began. "Recent events have raised concerns about emergency response procedures within our community. To ensure order is maintained, I am proposing a new rule. Residents must obtain prior approval from the HOA before calling emergency services unless there is an active fire or visible crime in progress." A stunned silence filled the room. Then, chaos erupted. People started shouting over one another, disbelief and outrage spreading like wildfire. "Are you serious?" one woman yelled. "You want us to get permission to call 911?" another man scoffed. "That's illegal," my mother said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. She stood up, and suddenly, the room fell silent. "You do not have the authority to dictate emergency services, Deborah," she continued. "This is not just unethical, it's a crime." Deborah's smile twitched, but she kept up her act. "It's just a formality to keep things orderly," she insisted. "I'm sure the city will understand." "The city already knows," my mother interrupted, gesturing toward the back of the room. All heads turned as the city attorney and 2 uniformed police officers stepped forward. Deborah visibly paled as the city attorney unfolded a document. "Deborah Williams, your attempt to interfere with emergency medical response is a violation of multiple city and state laws," he stated. "Your obstruction of an ambulance could have led to severe injury or death, and your proposed policy regarding emergency calls is unlawful." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and for the first time, Deborah looked rattled. My mother folded her arms. "Furthermore, fining me for calling 911? That's extortion. That fine is null and void, and you, Deborah, are facing legal action." Deborah's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I was just trying to maintain order," she stammered. The city attorney shook his head. "This isn't about order. This is about control. And you overstepped your authority in a way that could have had fatal consequences." The police officers stepped forward, and while they weren't there to arrest her, yet, the weight of the situation was clear. Deborah was done. The HOA board, clearly desperate to distance themselves from Deborah, wasted no time. A vote was called for her removal as president, and in a nearly unanimous decision, she was stripped of her title. The fine against my mother was immediately rescinded, and in a final blow, the board voted to fine Deborah $3,000 for obstructing emergency services. Deborah sat frozen, her perfect composure crumbling. The meeting adjourned, and as people filed out, I caught sight of her standing near the wall, staring at the HOA plaque that bore her name. It had been hanging there for years, a symbol of her unchecked power. But as if on cue, the plaque's rusted screws gave way, and it crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. A fitting end to her reign of terror. My mother, ever the cop, simply smirked. Guess even the walls know when it's time for a change. As the shattered pieces of the HOA plaque lay scattered on the floor, the room buzzed with murmurs and hushed conversations. People exchanged glances, some in shock, others in barely contained satisfaction. Deborah, still standing motionless by the wall, looked like a woman whose entire world had crumbled in a matter of minutes. She had ruled this community with an iron grip for years, dictating everything from the color of people's mailboxes to the number of guests they could have over during the holidays. But tonight, her reign had come to a spectacular end. My mother, leaning on her cane, watched the scene unfold with a calm, knowing expression. She had dealt with people like Deborah before, bullies who mistook their self-appointed power for real authority. I turned to her, half expecting her to gloat, but instead, she simply exhaled, shaking her head. "She thought she was untouchable," she said quietly. "People like that always do." Around us, neighbors who had once feared Deborah's wrath now whispered excitedly about the changes to come. The HOA board, eager to avoid any further legal scrutiny, announced an immediate review of all existing community rules. The mood in the room had shifted from tension to relief, like a storm that had finally, for a moment, I thought Deborah might accept her fate with some semblance of dignity, but of course, that was wishful thinking. She suddenly snapped out of her stupor, straightening her blazer and plastering on a forced, brittle smile. "Well," she said, her voice trembling with poorly concealed rage, "I suppose the community has spoken." She turned toward the HOA board, her eyes narrowing. "But I hope you all understand what you're doing. Without my leadership, this neighborhood will fall into complete disarray. You'll regret this." Her attempt to intimidate them fell flat. No one responded. Instead, one of the board members, a woman named Linda who had clearly been waiting for this moment for years, stepped forward. "We'll take our chances, Deborah," she said, crossing her arms. "Now, if you'll excuse us, We have real business to attend to." The crowd murmured in approval, and Deborah's face turned a deep shade of red. She wasn't used to being dismissed. For years, people had jumped to obey her every ridiculous decree, but now? Now, she was just another resident. A resident facing a hefty fine and possible legal consequences. And the worst part? There was nothing she could do about it. As the meeting officially adjourned, people began trickling out, but Deborah remained frozen in place. It was as if she couldn't quite process the fact that she no longer held power over them. I lingered by the door, watching as she finally turned toward my mother and me, her eyes dark with resentment. "I hope you're happy," she spat, her voice low and venomous. "You've ruined everything I built." I let out a humorless laugh. "You mean the ridiculous rules and the fear-mongering?" "Yeah, I'd say we're pretty happy to see it go." My mother, always the professional, simply gave her a level stare. "You did this to yourself, Deborah. You let your obsession with control override basic human decency. Blocking an ambulance? Fining someone for calling 911? That's not leadership. That's reckless endangerment." Deborah opened her mouth to argue, but for once, she had nothing to say. With a huff, she spun on her heel and stormed out of the building. The sound of her heels clicking against the tile was the only thing that filled the silence. I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last we saw of her. People like Deborah rarely knew when to quit. But for now, at least, her grip on the neighborhood was broken. The days that followed were nothing short of transformative. Without Deborah's constant interference, the HOA board wasted no time overturning some of her most ridiculous rules. The "no holiday decorations" policy? Gone. The absurdly strict lawn regulations? Relaxed. The fine system, which Deborah had used as her personal tool of intimidation? Re-evaluated, with several past fines refunded to residents who had been unfairly targeted. For the first time in years, people actually enjoyed living in the neighborhood again. One evening, as my mother and I sat on the porch, sipping tea, we watched kids playing freely on the sidewalks, something Deborah had once tried to ban due to safety concerns. A few neighbors stopped by to thank us, expressing their relief that her reign of terror had finally ended. My mother, ever the professional, downplayed her role, but I knew better. She had stood up to Deborah when no one else had dared, and in doing so, she had given this community a second chance. Just when I thought the saga was finally over, one last piece of poetic justice fell into place. A few weeks after the meeting, I received an email from the property management company overseeing the HOA. It was a formal announcement. Deborah Williams is no longer a resident of our community. Apparently, after losing her position and facing mounting legal fees, Deborah had put her house on the market and moved out. Whether she left out of shame or because she couldn't stand living in a neighborhood she no longer controlled, I didn't know. But the timing was perfect. When I told my mother, she simply smiled, taking a slow sip of her tea. "Funny how things work out," she mused. That evening, as I walked past the community center, I noticed something different. The shattered plaque bearing Deborah's name had been removed, replaced with a new one honoring the HOA's commitment to fairness and community. The difference was night and day. Deborah's reign was over, and in its place was something better. Something just. Something right.